wanted to go over the #1 mistake I see people making on single arm rows and why it's a mistake. So what's the mistake? Well, imagine someone is doing, just ignore the implement and the setup here, okay? It's just the concept is going to be the same regardless of what we're talking about, as long as it's a single arm row. When people are doing single arm rows, the thing that they tend to do is use other stuff to perform the row. So rather than, oh, that's a great sound from that blower right outside the window. So rather than just isolating the motion to their upper arm, their shoulder girdle, reaching all the way forward, what they tend to do is as they continue to reach, instead of just allowing this full shoulder protraction reaching to occur, they start to twist their spine away from the working side. Right, so you'll see how I will get to a certain point of not being able to shove my shoulder forward, i.e. I will not be able to stretch my lat anymore. And what will occur after this, if I keep reaching, is the only way I can keep moving forward is if I turn my back this way. Also, if I just kind of round myself forward. So basically the mistake is stop fucking moving your spine, right? So if this is spine motion, basically I'm just twisting my spine, I'm using my obliques, and this is also spine motion. I'm just rounding and arching and rounding and arching. I basically want to prevent those two things. #1, in this case, by keeping my hip pinned up against here, but also just firmly planting my opposite side hand so that I don't actually start to turn into my non-working arm. So if I were to do this with my other side, here's what it would look like. It would look something like this as the mistake, where I'm basically just creating what is known as trunk rotation and some hip rotation. And then I would also be creating, in the context of the mistake, spine arching, spine rounding. So people tend to do this kind of thing in tandem with the row to prevent that. Keep the hip anchored or the same side foot anchored to something. Plant your freaking opposite hand, hold it there firm, and then just isolate the rowing motion. Now, some people online gave this pushback, and I will talk about the pushback at the end of this video after I film the workout on my little bunny, as I have with previous long form videos, to expand on why I think the pushback is silly and to explain my perspectives on it. So as always, we are starting out the leg day at home gym, apartment gym with leg extension. Why? Because quads are important to me. As many of you know who have been watching, I train calves on my non-leg days. So today calves are not on the menu, but we will have leg extension, leg curl, and then a lower body press. For whatever reason, I kind of just feel like doing less volume today. Legs are something that are not a high priority for me. And as such, I do not do much volume for them, and I tend to keep my leg workouts fairly short, especially because I am starting up the occasional run, and yeah, I don't find that leg training is something that is super interesting or important to me, though I will say that across all of my leg training, I am still doing all sets to failure because that's how I like to do it. So today I'm thinking I'm just going to do one set of everything to total failure. In part, again, because legs are not a super high priority, but also just in part because today I have an especially high amount of work that I want to get done. I have a few things that I'm finishing up currently. One of which is I'm finishing my biomechanics manual. Link is in the description to purchase below if you want. And that's on pre-order for another 48 hours. So I'm finalizing that, and I am making sure that everything is good and uploaded. And in addition to that, I have an upcoming membership platform that is going to be launching soon, which in short is basically just a membership. It's a monthly fee or a quarterly fee or a yearly fee that you can pay. And basically what it will entail is access to me through a private community, live calls, and exclusive content. So if you're interested in that, I will put a link below. But this really wasn't supposed to be a content or a promotion plug as much as it was a leg workout, but that is what I have going on, and coincidentally, it happens to be something that is influencing the amount of volume that I'm doing today. So overall, I'm just going to hit a leg extension, a leg curl, and then I will probably just do some kind of lower body press. I will probably just do the single leg press. I will do one hard set of each of those, and I will call it a day. So it's a short day, one set to failure. To be honest, I think that if you are someone who is quote unquote at maintenance for a muscle group, I think you will be surprised at the amount of actual volume and effort needed to at minimum maintain muscle mass, and also potentially even to grow. Like it is possible, I think, to grow on one set a week, one very, very hard set per week. I think it's possible. I think to say that it's impossible is unreasonable. Of course, there's a lot of context that would play into what would happen in your particular case as an individual. Excuse me, but me personally, one set, best set. So here's my one set, full stack, pauses at the top into a little bit of momentum-y intent, just to kind of squeeze as much out of the set as possible. So we'll start slow and controlled, pausing at the top. All right, so now the rep speed is gonna slow. I'm not gonna be able to get up, so I'll just, little toss now. Okay. So something that may be of interest to some of you is that when you do a set like that, i.e. when you start slow and controlled and you're doing pauses at the end range, what will happen is you will get to failure with that tempo. But what is also interesting is that you can go beyond failure. It's not actually beyond failure, because what does that even mean? Failure is where you can't do more. So by definition, you can't train beyond failure. That's kind of a stupid thing to say. But I get what people mean. They're basically saying, I've defined failure first and foremost by this specific tempo within this specific range. And then when you can no longer achieve those things, specific range, tempo, whatever, then we're going, quote, beyond failure. Cool. A little huffing and puffing here. In this context, moving more slowly, pausing, using less momentum allows me to get, let's just say, I don't know how many that was, 10 pause or something. If I continue to use more control, less momentum, basically what I'm doing is I'm making it so that the top portion of the range is the hardest position. If I use control, if I don't do the tossing thing. But the minute now that I start to move the shin pad with an intent that is faster, higher acceleration, I'm generating more momentum. And I'm also magnifying the force in the bottom position. So whereas initially this is hardest at the top, by just simply using an intent to toss it a little bit and allowing it to sort of fall with a little bit more of a swinging, sort of fluid, musical intent, if you will, like you're playing jazz. You know, I've heard people say that before. You're playing jazz with the weights. Maybe that's just me. There will be a point at which starting to use a little bit of a looser technique is actually quite useful for extending a set. But notice how it's very intentionally placed. It's not random, and I'm not just tossing it like, you know, you see a lot of old school bodybuilders just toss things around. Some old school bodybuilders will use the sort of very methodical, jazzy-like tempo to sort of grease the groove of a motion. You see that a lot with cable pulling motions, pull downs and rows. But specifically as it relates to leg extension, I think that's a really unique strategy. Same thing with leg curls in many cases, where you can basically use a slow controlled intent. And then what you can do is you can basically just say, okay, I'm gonna change where I'm accelerating the load and by how much I'm accelerating the load. Because when you generate that momentum, it changes where the motion is harder, and you can extend the set as a consequence of that, because you're starting to basically pair different portions of the range of motion, i.e. different muscle lengths of the range of motion with different forces. So the initial technique, slow and controlled, hardest at the top. When I start to really toss it out of the bottom, I'm creating more impulse out of the bottom, which basically makes the bottom proportionately harder, which is something that I wasn't challenging in the initial part of the set. So if that was confusing, the short of it is basically slow and controlled is harder. You can toss the weight to start to extend the set. So anyway, that was my one set for quads on leg extension. I'm going to now do one set for leg curls. Let's get one warm up in. This is the full stack. So I may regret doing this, but full stack is kind of light on this one, so. All right, so good enough. We'll do one set to true failure there, and I'll do the same thing where I'm going to start out pausing in the bottom. I'm going to get to a point where I can no longer get to the bottom, and then I'm going to do that smooth jazz, more fluid, accelerating type tempo toward the end of the set. And you'll see I'm able to get more reps because I'm simply just changing the tempo, which is changing the forces, and specifically the forces as it relates to the different lengths of my hamstrings. I explained this last time, but I'll explain it one more time. On this machine, this pad is very unforgiving, and it makes it so that it's very uncomfortable to smush up into, regardless of where you place it. So to kind of account for that, I will actually lean forward and use my own hands to kind of support my thighs a little bit more. All right, so pausing at the bottom. Keeping an arch in the low back, or trying to. That's not me farting, it's just the pad rolling, don't worry. All right, so really, really slow rep. I'm gonna start to toss a little. Oh gosh. A little more English. Okay. So those were two good sets. Let's move on to the leg press. All right, so leg press. What are our goals? Mostly, in this context, to train some quads, but a lot of hips, just based on where this foot plate is. This is really well suited for glute-related goals. So just to talk through some concepts, if you were to start from the bottom up to sort of identify, okay, what's working? I think people generally have a good understanding that when your shin is 90 degrees from this foot plate, force on your hips is maximal. If you assume this is the line of force, it's going right through your knee. And generally, the lower down that you move your foot, the more that the foot plate will essentially be smushing this segment together, which is basically like the force of a leg extension. So in general, it's not a bad rule of thumb to think that 90 is a lot of glutes, and then this more acute angle. You know, you can imagine if I were like, had my feet really, really low, and now we're doing this kind of a thing, this is a lot of quads, right? Because again, when the feet are low, the force direction kind of goes like this, far from the knee, closer to the hip. Overall, if I wanted to do a more quaddy type of squat, I would prefer a leg press where I could naturally kind of put my feet lower. And I would also prefer a leg press that didn't sort of arc all the way downward like that, just because that starts to basically turn the direction of force up more toward a hip dominance. So anyway, that's all to just say that I'm doing this mostly for a hip dominant goal. And in order to do that, to set that up, I'm going to set this up so that my shin isn't perfectly 90 toward the bottom, but just a little bit. I do want a little bit of help from my quads as I go through this range of motion. Another thing too that I think people get very confused by is they will see me like ending in this kind of range of motion, and then they will assume that I'm using a very small amount of range. But the reality is, if you look at this angle, if my goals are to train my hips, my glutes, this angle between my femur and my trunk, i.e. the angle of the hip, I cannot hip flex, I can't smush my body more. What people are thinking is full range is if my foot went all the way here, right? This is full range from the knee and from the hip, but again, that's not part of the goal. Define the goal and work backwards from there. Don't just arbitrarily assume that more range is better or more motion of the leg press is better. You have to say, what is my goal? What joint actions are necessary for me to load that goal? What muscle lengths are necessary? And how should I place my foot relative to that? And how should I move relative to that goal? It's not just like, oh, more leg press motion equals better. Although in some cases, one could make the argument that if someone doesn't really have any idea what they're doing, it might not be a bad idea to just say, hey, listen, just do this thing for quote unquote full range, go from there. So I'm going to do one set on either side, single leg. And that is a good stopping point for me. Just kind of greasing the groove here, so to speak. I'm going to see if I can just start my first set. I like to also do pauses here toward the bottom. So I'm just going to go until I can't move out of the bottom. Okay. All right, I have no idea how many that was, but it was enough. Oh. All right, I didn't lie, but I kind of forgot about the fact a little bit that I wanted to do one set of adductors and abductors. I think that there is a case to be made that training the inner and outer sides of the hip can be hugely beneficial. Also just in terms of like actually training those muscles, I figure, okay, I kind of apply this logic to other groups, so I should apply it to these groups as well, where even if it's just a minor amount of volume, small amount of volume, you should probably train your adductors and your abductors directly. So I'm just going to do one set here, and then I'm going to do, yes, this was a warm up, and then I'm going to do one set on the, I mean, you'll see, it's just basically a single leg sideways hingey type of thing, something to kind of mimic the seated abduction, because unlike this one, that setting that up on here would be kind of a major pain in the ass, but suppose we could do that. So anyway, if you haven't seen me set this up before, ideally you have a bench. You put the bench basically wherever the edge of the seat is, you put that kind of in line with the cable, so you're a little bit in front of the cable. Put the back seat up, and then, yeah, basically just hold these to the inside of your thighs. Keep them braced on your knees. And it's actually a really good substitute for seated adduction. Okay. Oh dear. It's a final exercise, again, just like the others, one set, one hard set, call it a day. For this exercise, again, we're training the outer hips, really the glute med and the glute min, primarily with some upper glute max. All it is basically, if you think about like a hinge for your glute max is forward to backward. This is just a hinge basically sideways, right? So all we're doing is we're basically loading the equivalent of if I were to do some kind of kick out motion, but instead my foot is on the ground. So what I would recommend for this is brace your hand against the bench, grab a dumbbell, basically just sink into your hip and out of your hip. And you really do not need to overcomplicate this motion. A lot of the time it can be hard to picture how to like articulate your hips, but basically you want to think about like if your belly button is the sort of focal point, you want to think about turning your belly button into your working side and out of your working side. And to be honest, all that really means is just allow yourself to sink and then just push through the ground. Like don't overcomplicate it. When you do this too, you'll see from the side, do this side, some warm up, just basically soft bend. And all it is it's basically just a minor reach, right? So it's a fantastic movement for your side glutes. You know, you don't need a fancy cable setup. You don't need anything other than just an understanding of the physics of this stuff. So, I mean, this stuff is really light. So that was a 50. I think I may just go right to the 75. 75 is the heaviest that we have. Going to emphasize a pause in the bottom. And then just a brief step up. Another thing to make sure, just that you have that weight centered over your foot. You don't want to be trying to hold it on the outside because it's just going to pull you off center. Okay. So you should be feeling this kind of like right here. If you start to feel a lot of stuff in your obliques, what that means is much like the row that I was talking about. It means that if this is your belly button, it means that you're turning too much this way. You want to just think about turning this way with your hips into and out of the leg. So I'll do this other leg from the side so you can see it clearly. Again, just kind of treat it like a normal almost leg press. Just a leg press where you're just allowing your hips to sink. Okay. All right, everyone, we're back on the bunny for our bunny talk. Real quick before I go back to the thread related to the single arm rows and the pushback that I got and why I think it's silly pushback. I think overall, when you're looking to structure a leg day, the template that I laid out today is fairly solid in terms of like, you'll get all of what you need aside from calves, but I mentioned that because you got something for quads first, leg extension, hamstring second, leg curl, something for predominantly glutes / adductor magnus, right, your hip extensors, third in the leg press, fourth we had the adduction, and then fifth we had the abduction, which was that sideways hinge thing. And that's like a complete leg day insofar as targeting all the different muscles. You want to make sure you have a box checked for every group if that's, if legs are a really big goal of yours. Obviously, of course, individualizing it, so add more volume to more important muscle groups and more effort there. And don't do as much for groups that are not a priority. So because legs for me are not a priority, I just kind of want to maintain. I'm cool with the size of my legs, despite what some of you may think, aside from my calves. I'm happy with it. I just basically want my legs to be strong and healthy. I want to have no pain in my knees and my hips and my back, which, fingers crossed, I have been in that situation for a very long time now. So anyway, to get to the thread around the rowing, when I posted this reel online that you'll have all seen earlier in this video. I'll probably just place it right near the
Most people go years without realizing that they're making this one crucial mistake on rows, which is that instead of keeping their chest fixed in a position, what they do is as they pull, they start to turn their spine this way. And then as they load the stretch, they start to turn their spine in the opposite direction. Why is this a mistake? Well, because the rowing muscles do not turn the trunk. The muscles that turn the trunk are muscles like your obliques, which are not what we're trying to target with any pulling motion. Here's a simple way to fix it. Whenever you're pulling with a single arm, let's say it's my left arm, make sure that your right arm is preventing your body from twisting in any direction. If I'm pulling like this, my right arm should be pulling me a little bit in this direction and also a little bit forward to prevent me from slouching and rotating as I pull. This will make for just a more specific stimulus to the lats and the other muscles that you're trying to train with any row.
one of the challenges that I got in the comment section of that video was someone basically said something like, well, the isolated row where you're fixing your trunk and you're rowing is a poor movement choice because it doesn't integrate the oblique sling and the other muscles that are involved in natural pulling movements. And so foundationally, this is the kind of same claim that the functional patterns crowd will make, which is basically the following. If a movement does not mimic some sort of evolutionary foundational primal movement, it is therefore a poor pattern that will increase the risk of injury, increase the risk of pain, and increase the risk of dysfunction, whatever the hell that means. And we can address this argument in terms of the row example from multiple perspectives, okay? So the first perspective of, you should include the trunk rotation because that's more functional and that's how humans move, i.e. humans trunk rotate when they run, when they throw, when monkeys swing through trees. Right, so their argument in favor of the oblique twisting kind of a thing as not a mistake, and also their argument that says that isolated rowing like this is a poor movement, is founded upon this idea that basically whatever movements are foundational are better for us and will lead to better outcomes, and that these traditional gym movements like squats, deadlifts, isolated rows, isolation motions for any other group, these movements are bad because they're not sort of mimicking this evolutionary style. Okay, I think you all get that point. I've repeated it in several different ways now. So addressing this from multiple perspectives. The first and most obvious is that we have no research to support this kind of claim, number one, and of a claim, by the way, of any kind, not just specific to the rows, because there's no studies that have looked at twisting during rows versus not. But we have no research to suggest that there are even primal movements as things that exist. What does that even mean? If you say, okay, a deep squat is a primal functional movement, or okay, throwing is a primal functional movement, well, does that suddenly mean that any one of the component parts of that movement are not functional, right? Because if you're calling a deep squat primal because that's how humans shit for the longest period of time, and that's how a lot of people still might shit in certain parts of the world, if that's your argument, then how can you possibly say that loading knee extension with your quads is bad because loaded knee extension is a part of a squat? How can you say that loading hip extension in isolation, like in a leg press, of course, with the knee and with the ankle, is a bad thing, when really what you're doing is you're just loading the same muscles, you're loading the same joints, you're loading the same connective tissues, you're just imposing force on the body in different ways, and in certain instances, ways that you, the evolutionary biased, naturalistic fallacy person, are just not familiar with. So anyway, there's no empirical data to support any of these kind of wishy-washy, voodoo, functional patterns claims. That's all of it is bullshit, all of it is pseudoscience, all of it is basically arguments in favor of anecdote, which hold no empirical weight, as those of you who are familiar with fields of research would know. So that's one thing, is there's no research to back this. But even if we actually took the claim seriously, even if we actually said, okay, my goals are to train my lats, and this primal movement pattern is not this primal movement pattern, if we take a look at the concept of a single arm row, regardless of whether or not you are allowing your trunk to twist, you are loading trunk rotation. That is the entire reason why the trunk will twist in the first place as a mistake if you're trying to isolate your lats. And that is also the reason that you need your other side hand to not twist along with the load. Even if you do have your other hand to hold you and lock you in position, your muscles from an internal joint stabilizing, spine stabilizing, facet centrating, vertebral body non-shearing perspective All of that is just jargon to say your obliques need to stabilize your spine when you're rowing. Why? Well, because even if you could possibly imagine a situation where you were perfectly able to lock yourself in, your lats, given that they attach to your spine, pull on your spine. And if one lat is contracting while the other is not, your lats will try to rotate your spine away from the side that you're training. So if I'm pulling with my right, from an internal muscle joint mechanics perspective, my lats will try to trunk rotate me this way. And when that happens, my obliques need to pull me into this side, much like the same way, or much like is true, just by the cable load itself. So even if you did not apparently do any kind of trunk rotation motion in a row, you would still be loading trunk rotation. The problem with these people who make these kinds of claims, or any claims that are similar, evolutionary, naturalistic fallacy bullshit, all of these people basically have no conception of, or seemingly no conception, I should say, because I don't know the individual who's making such claims. They have seemingly no conception of just the most fundamental aspects, the most bedrock aspects of walking around on Earth, right? Force, torque, and their relationship to joints, and the joints' relationship to the muscles, and the muscles' relationship to the connective tissues. These are people who make vague generalizations and absolutes like this is a poor movement without actually understanding that it is actually loading the joint actions that they're claiming to be foundational in the first place. So even if you do take this argument seriously, which you definitely shouldn't, we would still arrive at a place where we were training some of those qualities regardless of how isolated we tried to be. Not to mention the fact that if someone's goal is to train their lats, why would you want to perform that exercise with other muscles? It's kind of like saying, my goals are to train my quads, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a deadlift. It's like, because what? Because a deadlift is functional, picking things up off the ground? I mean, it's functional for something, but if my goals are to thrash my quads, there's no better way to do that than just by sitting down on a leg extension if I have no other associated goals. So I hope that argument, from my perspective, makes sense. I'm always open to pushback, disagreement. I do get fired up by these things, as you can probably tell, because I hate that so many people are misled by such bullshit. And I hate the fact that so many people have a degree of understanding that makes it seem like the stuff that I'm saying and the stuff that the functional movement pattern people are saying are sort of equal weight. And if you're still listening to this now, I hope you get that they are not of equal weight. My side of the argument just basically describes things as we physically understand them, i.e. the forces, the torques, and how they relate to this. And the other side of the aisle here basically tells a convenient, emotionally driven story that sounds convincing and that, yes, will occasionally get results for certain people. But you have to keep in mind that, like all other results, many things can create results, and it's why we rely on empirical research and data over long stretches of time to make such absolute claims. So the next time you hear someone invoking this sort of naturalistic evolutionary fallacy, and or they are coupling it with such a statement like this is a poor movement pattern because function, call that into question, call the bullshit, or just send them this video.